The crack of gunfire echoed across the dusty streets of Wichita, Kansas, as Margaret Whitfield clutched her valise tighter and lowered her head, hurrying past the saloon where the commotion had erupted. The year was 1878, and she had never imagined her life would come to this, banished from her family home in St. Louis, Missouri, with nothing but a small satchel of belongings and the remnants of her broken heart. "Watch where you're stepping, madam," a gruff voice called as she nearly collided with a man loading supplies onto a wagon. "Streets ain't safe for a lady alone, especially with those rowdy cowboys just paid their wages." Margaret nodded politely but kept moving. She'd learned quickly that lingering too long in conversation invited questions about why a well-bred young woman of 20 was traveling alone. Why her dress, though of fine quality, showed signs of wear, and most dangerously, why she'd left behind the comfort of her father's banking fortune. Thomas Reynolds, even thinking his name caused a painful tightening in her chest. The son of her father's clerk, with his gentle smile and dreams of opening his own bookshop someday. A poor man with rich ambitions, too poor for Harrison Whitfield's only daughter. "No daughter of mine will throw herself away on a penniless clerk," her father had thundered when he discovered their secret meetings. "You'll marry Senator Crawford's son as planned, or you'll leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back." Margaret had chosen the latter, naively believing that Thomas would follow as promised. But faced with her father's threats to destroy any chance of future employment, Thomas had retreated. "Perhaps your father is right," he'd said, unable to meet her eyes. "What kind of life could I give you?" The memory still stung as she approached the Wichita Hotel, a modest establishment compared to the grand homes she'd once frequented in St. Louis. Her funds were dwindling faster than anticipated. She needed work soon. "Room for the night," she told the clerk, carefully counting out the coins from her diminishing purse. "Just yourself, miss?" The clerk eyed her suspiciously. "Yes," she answered firmly, practiced at ignoring such looks. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Margaret sat heavily on the mattress, removing her bonnet to reveal auburn hair once elaborately styled by her lady's maid, but now simply pinned back. At 20, she should have been preparing for her debut into society, not wondering how to earn her next meal. A commotion in the street drew her to the window. A small crowd had gathered around two men, one finely dressed in a tailored suit, the other in the practical garb of a working cowboy. The cowboy stood tall, dust covering his clothes but dignity evident in his stance as the suited man gesticulated wildly. "You'll regret crossing me, Fletcher," the suited man shouted. "This town knows who butters their bread." The cowboy Fletcher merely adjusted his hat and replied in a voice too low for Margaret to hear, but whatever he said caused the other man's face to redden before he stormed away. The small crowd dispersed, several people clapping the cowboy on the shoulder as they departed. Margaret watched him for a moment longer before turning away. Another rich man throwing his weight around, she'd seen enough of that to last a lifetime. Morning came with bright sunshine streaming through the thin curtains. Margaret dressed carefully in her simplest dress, a practical blue cotton that wouldn't appear too fine for the position she hoped to secure. She'd seen a notice in the hotel lobby seeking help at the local mercantile. The streets of Wichita were already bustling with morning activity, freight wagons delivering goods, shopkeepers sweeping storefronts, and cowboys stumbling bleary-eyed from saloons after long nights. She kept her eyes forward, ignoring the occasional appreciative glance or whistle. Preston's mercantile was larger than she expected, with a wide porch and large display windows showcasing everything from farm equipment to ladies' bonnets. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. "Be with you in a moment," called a female voice from behind a mountain of fabric bolts. Margaret waited patiently, observing the well-organized shop with its barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of tinned goods, and glass cases of jewelry and personal items. It smelled of coffee, leather, and the faint sweetness of candy. "Now then, how can I help you?" A plump woman in her 50s emerged, straightening her apron. "I've come about the position," Margaret said. "The notice in the hotel." The woman's friendly expression faltered slightly as she took in Margaret's appearance. "You're looking for work, as a shop girl?" "Yes, madam." "I can read and write, keep accounts, and learn quickly." Mrs. Preston, for that was surely who she was, pursed her lips. "You don't look like the type who needs employment, dear." Margaret swallowed her pride. "Appearances can be deceiving. I'm in need of honest work, and I'll work hard." After a moment's consideration, Mrs. Preston nodded. "My husband handles the hiring. He's due back shortly. What's your name, dear?" "Margaret Whitfield, madam." "Well, Miss Whitfield, you can wait in the back room. There's fresh coffee." The back room served as both office and storeroom, with a desk piled high with ledgers and invoices. Margaret sat gingerly on a wooden chair, wondering if she should offer to organize the chaotic paperwork as a demonstration of her skills. Before she could decide, the bell jangled again, followed by heavy footsteps and a deep voice greeting Mrs. Preston. Margaret straightened her posture and smoothed her skirt, preparing for the interview. The man who entered was not what she expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, he removed his hat to reveal dark hair flecked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered from the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. "Mr. Preston, this young lady is inquiring about the position, Mrs." Preston said, following him in, the man's brow furrowed. "I'm not Preston. Frank's gone to Topeka for supplies." He turned to Margaret, and recognition flickered across his features. "You're the lady from the hotel window." Margaret blinked in surprise, now recognizing him as the cowboy from yesterday's confrontation. Yes, I suppose I am," he smiled, extending a hand. "Zachary Fletcher. I manage the Preston cattle operation outside town." She shook his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Margaret Whitfield. Miss Whitfield wants the shop position," Mrs. Preston explained, "though if you ask me, she looks more suited to the schoolhouse than a mercantile." Zachary Fletcher studied Margaret with unexpected perception. "Sometimes folks find themselves in places they never expected to be," he said quietly. "The position involves more than just minding the store. The Prestons need someone who can manage correspondence and bookkeeping, too." "I'm qualified for that," Margaret said quickly. "My father," she stopped, unwilling to mention her connection to Harrison Whitfield, whose banking connections extended even to frontier towns like Wichita. "Your father," Fletcher prompted. "He ensured I received a thorough education," she finished carefully. Something in his expression suggested he caught her hesitation but chose not to pursue it. "Frank won't be back until tomorrow. In the meantime, Mrs. Preston could use help with inventory." Mrs. Preston nodded. "We could see how you manage for a day." "Wage is 25 cents per day to start, with room and board available above the shop for an additional charge." It was less than Margaret had hoped, but more than she could refuse. "Thank you. I'll do my best," as Mrs. Preston led her back to the shop floor to begin explaining procedures. Margaret noticed Fletcher watching her with curiosity. She straightened her shoulders. She might have fallen from society's graces, but she still had her dignity and determination. The day passed in a blur of learning prices, locations of merchandise, and how to operate the cash register. By closing time, Margaret's feet ached and her head swam with information, but she felt a strange satisfaction. She had earned her first wage through honest work. "You did well today, Mrs. Preston said, counting out coins. "Come back tomorrow morning, and if Frank approves, the position is yours." "Thank you, Mrs. Preston. I appreciate the opportunity." As Margaret stepped outside, the setting sun bathed the street in golden light. Her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since morning, and she made her way toward a modest cafe she'd noticed earlier. "Miss Whitfield." She turned to find Zachary Fletcher approaching, his hat in his hands. He'd cleaned up since morning, his shirt crisp despite the day's dust. "Mr. Fletcher," she acknowledged with a small nod. "I wondered if you might join me for supper," he said. "The cafe serves a decent stew and I'd welcome the company." Margaret hesitated. In St. Louis, dining alone with a man would be scandalous, but here in Wichita, social rules seemed more flexible. And truthfully, the prospect of a meal without dipping further into her meager savings was tempting. That's very kind of you, Mr. Fletcher. The cafe was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the savory aroma of beef stew. They settled at a corner table, where a motherly waitress greeted Fletcher by name. The usual Zach, and for the lady, 2 beef stews, Martha, and some of that fresh bread if you have it. As the waitress bustled away, an awkward silence fell. Margaret found herself studying her companion more carefully. Though dressed plainly, there was an air of quiet confidence about him that suggested education beyond what most cowboys possessed. "Have you been in Wichita long, Miss Whitfield?" he finally asked. "I arrived yesterday," she admitted. "My journey has been somewhat impromptu. Few women travel alone in these territories without compelling reasons," he observed. Margaret stiffened. "I don't believe my reasons are a suitable topic for dinner conversation, Mr. Fletcher." To her surprise, he chuckled. "Fair enough. I reckon we've all got stories we'd rather not tell over stew." He paused as Martha returned with 2 steaming bowls and a basket of bread. "What do you think of our little city so far?" Grateful for the change in subject, Margaret spoke of her initial impressions of Wichita, its surprising size, the mix of frontier roughness and emerging civilization, the busy cattle yards. Fletcher nodded. "Wichita's growing fast. The railroad brings new folks every day. Some stay, some move on west." He broke a piece of bread. "What about you, planning to stay if I secure the position at the Mercantile?" "Yes." She tasted the stew. It was surprisingly good. "And you manage the Preston cattle operation for the past 3 years." "Before that, I drove cattle up from Texas, rode for various outfits." He shrugged. "Decided it was time to put down some roots." "And the man you argued with yesterday," Fletcher's expression darkened slightly. "Edward Harrington owns the bank and half the businesses in town. Believes that entitles him to own the people too." The description reminded Margaret uncomfortably of her father. "What was the disagreement about?" "Water rights," Fletcher sighed. "Harrington's been buying up land around the creek that waters the Preston herd, threatening to dam it unless Frank sells him a parcel Frank's refusing to part with." "That sounds illegal," Margaret frowned. "It's not right, but out here, law's sometimes whatever the man with the most money says it is." He studied her. "You seem to understand that concept better than most new arrivals." Margaret focused on her stew, uncomfortable with his perception. "Money does tend to influence justice everywhere, I think." They finished their meal with lighter conversation about the town and its characters. Fletcher proved to be well-informed and surprisingly well-read, quoting Shakespeare when describing the local sheriff's dilemmas. As they left the cafe, the evening had cooled and Margaret shivered slightly in her light dress. "Allow me," Fletcher said, removing his jacket and placing it around her shoulders before she could protest. The weight was warm and smelled of leather and pine. "Thank you, but this isn't necessary. My mother would haunt me if I let a lady walk cold," he said with a smile. "I'll see you safely to the hotel." They walked in companionable silence through streets now quieting as businesses closed for the night. Occasional bursts of piano music and laughter erupted from saloons, but Fletcher steered them along the more respectable thoroughfares. At the hotel entrance, Margaret returned his jacket. "Thank you for supper, Mr. Fletcher, and the company." He replaced his jacket and tipped his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Whitfield. I hope Frank Preston has the good sense to hire you tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever brought you to Wichita, I hope you find what you're looking for here." With that enigmatic statement, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret wondering about the cowboy who quoted Shakespeare and seemed to see more than she wished to reveal. The following morning, Margaret presented herself at the Mercantile promptly at 7. Mr. Preston had indeed returned, a balding man with spectacles and a perpetual air of distraction. His interview consisted mainly of confirming she could read, write, and calculate sums accurately. Mrs. Preston says you managed well yesterday, he said, peering at her over his spectacles. Though you seem a bit fine for shop work. I assure you, Mr. Preston, I'm not afraid of hard work, he nodded absently. 25 cents daily to start, Sundays off. Room upstairs is $3 monthly if you want it. Includes breakfast and supper with us. The arrangement would stretch her remaining funds, but only temporarily. Once she began earning, she could save enough to perhaps pursue her own ambitions someday. Thank you, Mr. Preston, I accept. Her new room above the Mercantile was larger than the hotel room, with a real bed, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the main street. Margaret unpacked her few belongings, wondering what her mother would think of her daughter working as a shop girl in a frontier town. Eliza Whitfield had been a gentle soul who rarely contradicted her husband, but had whispered to Margaret on her deathbed 2 years prior. "Follow your heart, my darling. I never did, and it's my greatest regret." Margaret had tried to follow that advice with Thomas, only to discover his heart wasn't as steadfast as she'd believed. Now she wondered if her mother's advice had been a luxury only the wealthy could afford, or perhaps only the truly brave. The following weeks established a routine. Margaret rose early to help Mrs. Preston prepare the shop, spent her days serving customers and organizing merchandise, and devoted evenings to bringing order to the chaotic bookkeeping system. Mr. Preston, recognizing her skill with numbers, increasingly left the accounts in her hands. She saw Zachary Fletcher occasionally when he came to town for supplies. Each time, he greeted her warmly and inquired after her welfare. Sometimes he lingered, discussing books they'd both read or news from the East. Margaret found herself looking forward to these conversations, though she chided herself for it. She'd learned her lesson about allowing sentiment to override sense. One busy Saturday, nearly a month after her arrival in Wichita, the shop bell jangled as Margaret was helping a farmer's wife select fabric for a new dress. "Be right with you," she called without looking up from the bolt of calico she was measuring. "No hurry, Miss Whitfield, I can wait." Margaret's fingers fumbled on the measuring stick at the sound of Edward Harrington's voice. She'd seen the banker from a distance, but had avoided any direct interaction, feeling instinctively that his type, wealthy, powerful, accustomed to deference, was exactly what she'd fled from in St. Louis. After completing Mrs. Miller's purchase, Margaret turned reluctantly to Harrington. Immaculately dressed in a suit that must have come from St. Louis or even New York, he twirled his walking stick while examining her with undisguised interest. "How may I help you, sir?" she asked with professional courtesy. "Edward Harrington, Miss Whitfield. I own the Wichita Bank and Trust." He extended a hand as if expecting her to shake it or perhaps even kiss it. Margaret briefly touched his fingers. "What can I help you find today, Mr. Harrington?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, I came to see you. Word has spread about Preston's new shop girl with the refined manners and education. Quite the mystery." "There's no mystery, sir. I simply needed employment and was fortunate to find it here." She moved behind the counter, establishing a barrier between them. "A young woman of your obvious breeding working as a shop girl is indeed a mystery," he persisted, "especially when there are more suitable positions available. I'm quite satisfied with my current employment, thank you." Harrington leaned on his walking stick. "I'm in need of a personal secretary, someone to manage correspondence and appointments. The salary would be significantly more generous than what Frank Preston can afford to pay." The offer was tempting purely for financial reasons. Margaret's savings were nearly depleted, and though she had room and board, her wage provided little excess for rebuilding her independence. "That's kind of you, Mr. Harrington, but I've given my word to the Prestons. Loyalty is admirable, Miss Whitfield, but one must be practical." He named a sum that made Margaret's eyes widen despite herself. "Plus private accommodations above the bank, of course, much more suitable for a lady of your background." Margaret wondered how much he'd discovered about her. "May I ask why you'd offer such a position to someone you've only just met?" "Let's just say I recognize quality when I see it." His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Consider my offer. I'll expect your answer by Monday." With a tip of his hat, he departed, leaving a faint scent of expensive cologne in his wake. Mrs. Preston emerged from the storeroom. "What did Harrington want?" she asked suspiciously. "He offered me a position as his secretary," Margaret admitted. The older woman snorted. "I'll bet he did. That man goes through secretaries faster than some men go through whiskey. You'd be wise to stay clear of him, dear." "I have no intention of accepting," Margaret assured her, though the generous salary lingered in her thoughts. That evening after closing, Margaret was balancing the ledger when the bell jangled. She looked up to find Zachary Fletcher standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'm sorry, we're closed," she began, then smiled when she recognized him. "Oh, Mr. Fletcher, did you need something from the store?" "Actually, I came to see you," he said, his expression unusually serious. "Heard Harrington paid you a visit today." Margaret set down her pencil, surprised. "News travels quickly. Small town." He approached the counter. "He offer you a job?" "He did. I declined." Relief visibly crossed Fletcher's face. "Good. Harrington's not a man to work for, especially for a woman alone." "So Mrs. Preston implied." Margaret studied him curiously. "Did you ride into town specifically to warn me about Mr. Harrington?" Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. "Partly. Also came to invite you to the town social next Saturday. Dancing, food, decent company." The invitation surprised her. "That's very kind, but I'm not sure I should." "It's not just kindness," he interrupted. "I genuinely enjoy your company, Miss Whitfield." Margaret hesitated. She'd avoided social gatherings, fearing questions about her past. But after weeks of work with little respite, the prospect of music and dancing held appeal. "In that case, I'd be pleased to accept," she said finally. "Though I should warn you, my dancing may be rusty." His smile warmed his entire face. "Then we'll be well matched, as I've been told I have 2 left feet." Saturday evening arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for the social being held in the town square. Margaret wore her one good dress, a green silk she'd carefully preserved from her St. Louis life. It was perhaps too fine for a frontier town gathering, but she'd made adjustments, removing some of the more elaborate trimmings to render it less ostentatious. Mrs. Preston helped her style her hair, commenting admiringly on its rich auburn color. "You'll be the prettiest girl there, even without all those fancy jewels St. Louis girls usually wear." Margaret stiffened. "What makes you think I'm from St. Louis?" The older woman patted her shoulder. "You mentioned it when feverish last week, that awful cold you caught. Don't worry, dear. Whatever sent you running from there is your business." Zachary arrived promptly at 7, wearing a clean black suit that transformed him from cowboy to gentleman, though his tan and the strength in his bearing still marked him as a man of the outdoors. "Miss Whitfield," he said, momentarily appearing speechless as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." "Thank you." She felt a blush rising. "You look quite handsome yourself, Mr. Fletcher." He offered his arm, and they walked the short distance to the town square, where lanterns had been strung between trees, a wooden platform erected for musicians, and tables laden with food contributed by the townswomen. Many heads turned as they arrived. Margaret was accustomed to being noticed in St. Louis society, but this felt different, less about her father's wealth and more about being a newcomer escorted by one of the town's respected men. "Zach, about time you brought a lady to one of these affairs," called a middle-aged man Margaret recognized as the blacksmith. Fletcher tipped his hat, smiling but guiding Margaret past before the conversation could develop. "Ignore Watson. He considers himself the town matchmaker." "And what would he think he's matching?" Margaret asked lightly. Fletcher gave her a sidelong glance. "A hard-working cowboy with aspirations above his station and a mysterious Eastern lady with secrets in her eyes." The directness took her breath away. Before she could formulate a response, the band struck up a lively tune and Fletcher held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Whitfield?" Despite his self-deprecating comment about his dancing abilities, Fletcher moved with surprising grace. Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the evening, the music, the friendly atmosphere, even the curious but mostly welcoming looks from the townspeople. During a break between dances, Fletcher fetched them punch, and they found a bench beneath an elm tree at the edge of the square. "You're smiling," he observed. "First time I've seen you truly smile since you arrived in Wichita." Margaret hadn't realized it herself. "I suppose I am. It's been a difficult time recently. Want to talk about it?" When she hesitated, he added, "Sometimes it's easier to tell your troubles to someone who's not part of the story." Perhaps it was the magic of the evening or simply the weight of carrying her secrets alone for so long, but Margaret found herself speaking. "I left St. Louis because I defied my father. He wanted me to marry a man of his choosing, a senator's son with political ambitions and a fortune to match my father's banking empire." She traced the rim of her punch cup. "I refused because I believed myself in love with someone else." "The poor man you were cast out for loving," Fletcher said quietly. Margaret looked up sharply. "How did you?" Mrs. Miller talks. Says she overheard you mumbling in your sleep when you had that fever. Something about being cast out for loving a poor man. Embarrassment flooded her. "Thomas Reynolds was my father's clerk. Intelligent, educated, with dreams of owning a bookshop someday. When my father discovered our attachment, he gave me an ultimatum: marry Senator Crawford's son or leave with nothing. And you chose to leave." There was respect in his voice. "I thought Thomas would follow. He'd spoken of going west, starting fresh." She gave a bitter laugh. "But faced with the reality of my father's threat to blacklist him from any decent employment in the country, his courage failed. He decided perhaps my father was right. What could he offer me but poverty?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "And now you're here, making your own way." "Trying to," she agreed. "Though some days I wonder if I made a terrible mistake. Not because of Thomas. I've realized what I felt was more infatuation than love, but because I was woefully unprepared for the realities of supporting myself." "Yet you're managing admirably," he said. "The Prestons sing your praises. The store's never been so well organized." "It's not the life I was raised for," she admitted. "But there's satisfaction in earning my own way that I never felt in my father's house, where everything came with conditions and expectations." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "My father was a plantation owner in Georgia before the war. Lost everything afterward, had to learn to work with his hands instead of just giving orders." He looked at his calloused palms. "He told me once it was the making of him as a man, learning the value of what he earned himself." "Your father sounds wise." "He was." Fletcher's expression grew distant. "Died 5 years ago. Mother followed a year later." "I'm sorry." Margaret hesitated, then asked, "How did you come to manage the Preston Ranch?" "After my parents died, I drifted west, drove cattle, broke horses, did what work I could find. Met Frank Preston when he was buying cattle in Dodge City. He needed someone who understood both cattle and business." Fletcher shrugged. "I had education from before the war and practical experience after, suited his needs." The band struck up again, and Fletcher stood, offering his hand. "Another dance?" As they rejoined the festivities, Margaret found herself studying Zachary Fletcher with new eyes. Here was a man who had known privilege and lost it, yet built something meaningful from the ruins, not unlike what she was attempting herself. The evening continued pleasantly until Margaret noticed Edward Harrington watching from the edge of the gathering, his expression calculating as his gaze followed her and Fletcher. She instinctively moved closer to her companion. "Harrington's here," she murmured. Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Ignore him. This is a community gathering. Even he has a right to attend." But as the night wore on, Harrington made his way closer, finally intercepting them as Fletcher returned from fetching fresh punch. "Miss Whitfield," Harrington said smoothly, "you look enchanting this evening. Perhaps you'll favor me with the next dance." Before Margaret could respond, Fletcher stepped to her side. "Miss Whitfield has promised this dance to me, Harrington." "Surely you can spare one dance, Fletcher." Harrington's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. Unless you've staked some claim I'm unaware of. The lady makes her own choices, Fletcher replied evenly. Margaret placed a hand on Fletcher's arm. Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Harrington, but I am indeed promised for the next several dances. Harrington's expression hardened. Have you considered my offer, Miss Whitfield? Monday approaches. I have, and my answer remains the same. I'm content with my current position. A pity. I wonder if your father would approve of his daughter rejecting such an advantageous opportunity. The pointed reference made Margaret's blood run cold. Harrison Whitfield has always valued prudent financial decisions, from what I understand. Fletcher's hand covered Margaret's where it rested on his arm. You seem to know an awful lot about Miss Whitfield's family, Harrington. Banking circles are surprisingly small, even between St. Louis and Wichita. Harrington's gaze returned to Margaret. Your father was most distressed by your departure, Miss Whitfield, or perhaps by the scandal it nearly caused. There was no scandal, Margaret said stiffly, merely a difference of opinion about my future. Indeed. Well, should you reconsider my offer, either of them, you know where to find me. With a tip of his hat, Harrington melted back into the crowd. Fletcher guided Margaret to a quiet corner. Are you all right? She realized she was trembling. He's been investigating me. My father must have made inquiries through his banking connections. Does that worry you? I don't know. She wrapped her arms around herself. I didn't leave anything unresolved in St. Louis, but my father is a proud man. Having his daughter working as a shop girl in Kansas would be humiliating for him. Fletcher's expression darkened. You think Harrington might use that information somehow? He implied as much. She sighed. Perhaps I should have accepted his job offer. No, Fletcher said firmly. Harrington doesn't want a secretary, he wants. He stopped, seemingly uncomfortable with voicing his thoughts. A mistress, Margaret finished bluntly. Yes, I gathered that impression as well. Fletcher looked surprised at her frankness, then nodded. Harrington's wife stays back east most of the year. His secretaries tend to be young, attractive women who don't last long in the position. The music had shifted to a slower waltz. Around them, couples moved in graceful circles beneath the lantern light. Would you like to go? Fletcher asked gently. I can escort you back to the Mercantile. Margaret considered for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. No, I won't let Harrington's insinuations ruin our evening. She managed a smile. Besides, you promised me another dance, and I intend to collect. Relief crossed his features. In that case, Miss Whitfield, may I have the honor? As they joined the other dancers, Margaret found herself drawing closer to Fletcher than propriety strictly allowed, seeking comfort in his solid presence. He seemed to understand, his hand warm and steady at her waist as they circled the makeshift dance floor. Whatever Harrington's planning, you're not alone, he said quietly. The Prestons think highly of you and you've made friends here. Including you, she asked, looking up at him. His eyes, dark in the lantern light, held hers. Especially me. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings developing beyond mere friendship. Margaret felt a flutter of both excitement and fear. After Thomas's betrayal, she'd sworn to guard her heart more carefully. The rest of the evening passed without further incident from Harrington, though Margaret occasionally felt his gaze following her. By the time Fletcher escorted her back to the Mercantile, the uncomfortable encounter had faded somewhat, replaced by the memory of dances shared and conversations enjoyed. At the Mercantile's side entrance, which led to the upstairs rooms, Fletcher hesitated. I enjoyed this evening, Miss Whitfield, Margaret, if I may. You may, she said softly. And I enjoyed it too, Zachary. He smiled at the use of his given name. About Harrington, don't let him intimidate you, but perhaps be cautious until we know what he's planning. The word warmed her more than it should have. I care about what happens to you, he said simply. More than I probably should after such a short acquaintance. Margaret thought of the past weeks, his kindness when she'd first arrived, their conversations about books and ideas, the respect he showed for her intelligence and independence. I don't think time always measures the significance of a connection, she said. Some people know each other for years without truly connecting, he nodded thoughtfully. My father used to say some souls recognize each other, no matter when or where they meet. The statement hung between them, full of possibility. Fletcher took a step closer, and for a moment, Margaret thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles. Good night, Margaret. I'll call on you tomorrow if I may. I'd like that, she replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret found herself comparing Zachary Fletcher to Thomas Reynolds. Thomas had been refined, educated, full of poetic declarations, but when tested, his devotion had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. Fletcher was different, a man who had faced hardship and emerged stronger, who spoke less but meant what he said. And yet, she reminded herself, she knew little of his circumstances beyond what he'd shared. Was she merely repeating her mistake with Thomas, romanticizing a man whose practical situation made a future together unlikely? The question troubled her dreams. But even so, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation she hadn't felt in months. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Margaret attended church with the Prestons, hyper-aware of both Fletcher's presence several pews ahead and Harrington's calculating gaze from across the aisle. After the service, Fletcher approached, exchanging pleasantries with the Prestons before asking Margaret if she'd care to walk with him. They strolled through Wichita's quieter residential streets, where frontier pragmatism was gradually giving way to touches of Eastern refinement: white picket fences, small gardens, modest porches with rocking chairs. You mentioned wanting to see the Preston Ranch someday, Fletcher said. Mrs. Preston is organizing a picnic there next Sunday. Would you like to come? I'd enjoy that, Margaret replied. It would be nice to see something beyond the town limits. It's nothing grand, a working cattle operation, but there's good grazing land and a creek running through that makes a fine picnic spot. As they walked, Fletcher spoke of his hopes for the ranch, his plans to eventually buy a small parcel of land for himself. Margaret found herself drawn to his practical ambitions, so different from Thomas's vague dreams or the entitled expectations of men like Senator Crawford's son. What about you? He asked. Do you plan to stay in Wichita permanently? The question gave her pause. I haven't thought that far ahead. When I left St. Louis, I was simply running away. Now I'm trying to build something of my own, but I'm not sure what that looks like yet. Any regrets about leaving? Margaret considered. I regret the pain it caused my father, despite our differences. I regret my naivety in believing love alone would be enough. She looked up at the clear Kansas sky, but I don't regret choosing my own path, even with all its difficulties. Fletcher nodded approvingly. That's courage, not the absence of fear or regret, but moving forward despite them. They had circled back toward the Mercantile when they spotted Edward Harrington on the opposite boardwalk. Deep in conversation with a man Margaret didn't recognize, a sharply dressed stranger with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to unsavory work. Fletcher subtly guided Margaret to turn down a side street. Best to avoid Harrington today, he murmured. Who was that with him? Trouble, Fletcher said grimly. Name's Jenkins. Does special work for businessmen with problems that can't be solved through legal channels. A chill ran through Margaret. You think Harrington hired him because of me? Could be coincidence, Fletcher said, though his expression suggested he didn't believe it. But Harrington doesn't like being refused, and he particularly doesn't like being refused in favor of me. In favor of you. Margaret repeated, confused. Fletcher's expression was grim. Harrington and I have history. 3 years ago, when Preston offered me the ranch manager position, Harrington had recommended his nephew for the same job. He's held a grudge ever since. That seems petty for a man of his standing. Harrington believes money entitles him to get his way in all things. Fletcher's jaw tightened. And now he's seen you with me after refusing his offer. In his mind, that's another victory for me at his expense. Margaret felt a surge of indignation. I'm not a prize to be won in some male rivalry. Of course not, Fletcher agreed quickly. But Harrington doesn't see women as people with their own choices, just possessions to acquire. They reached the mercantile's back entrance. Be careful, Fletcher warned. If you see Jenkins hanging around, find Frank or Mrs. Preston immediately. You think I'm in danger? Probably not physically, he reassured her. More likely Harrington's digging for leverage, something to force you to accept his offer or return to St. Louis. The thought of being forced back to her father's house, or worse, into Harrington's employ under dubious circumstances, filled Margaret with dread. Perhaps I should leave Wichita, she said quietly. Find another town where running won't solve it, Fletcher interrupted gently. If Harrington's made inquiries to St. Louis, your father likely knows where you are now. And men like Harrington have connections in every significant town between here and the Mississippi. He was right, Margaret realized. She'd run once and found temporary refuge, but she couldn't keep running forever. Then what do you suggest? Fletcher considered. For now, be vigilant but go about your business normally. I'll make some inquiries about what Harrington and Jenkins are planning. He hesitated, then added, and perhaps consider whether confronting your past directly might be better than waiting for it to catch up with you. You mean write to my father? The idea made her stomach clench, or prepare for the possibility that he might come to you. Fletcher touched her arm gently. Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. The promise warmed her despite her fears. Thank you, Zachary, he tipped his hat. Until next Sunday then, for the ranch picnic, she nodded, managing a smile. I'll look forward to it. The week passed in a blur of normal activity at the mercantile, though Margaret found herself constantly watching for Jenkins or signs of Harrington's machinations. Fletcher rode into town midweek, ostensibly for supplies but clearly also checking on her welfare. Any trouble? He asked quietly while examining a new shipment of work gloves. None, she reported. Though I received a telegram yesterday that was blank when I opened it, probably a mistake, but Fletcher frowned. Could be a warning or someone checking if you're monitoring your correspondence. The ominous possibilities hung between them until Mrs. Preston approached with a customer question, forcing them to resume normal conversation. By Sunday, Margaret had almost convinced herself that her fears were exaggerated. She dressed carefully for the ranch picnic in her sturdiest skirt and a practical blouse, excited despite her lingering concerns. The Prestons had arranged for several wagons to transport the churchgoers who wished to attend, and Margaret found herself sharing a seat with Mrs. Preston and two other women from town. The Preston Ranch lay 7 miles outside Wichita, an expanse of rolling prairie bisected by a winding creek and dotted with grazing cattle. The main house was modest but well built, with a wide porch and sturdy outbuildings. A smaller cabin stood a short distance away, which Mrs. Preston identified as Fletcher's residence. Zach could have a room in the main house, she explained, but he values his privacy. Says a man needs his own hearth, however humble. The picnic site was a grassy area beside the creek, shaded by cottonwoods. Tables had been assembled from boards and sawhorses, covered with checkered cloths and laden with food brought by the churchgoers. Children ran laughing through the grass while the men discussed cattle prices and the women arranged the feast. Margaret found herself helping organize the food tables, conscious of Fletcher moving among the guests in his role as host in the Prestons' absence. They were attending their daughter's confinement in Topeka and had left Fletcher in charge of both ranch and picnic. When the meal was announced, Fletcher appeared at Margaret's side, guiding her to a place at one of the tables. I've hardly had a chance to speak with you, he said. How does the ranch compare to your expectations? It's beautiful, she said sincerely. There's a sense of possibility here, as if a person could breathe and grow, he smiled, understanding in his eyes. That's exactly how I felt when I first saw it. After years of drifting, it felt like somewhere I could build something lasting. They ate amid general conversation, with neighbors inquiring politely about Margaret's background. She had prepared simple answers that were truthful without revealing too much. Yes, she was from St. Louis. Yes, she had come west seeking new opportunities. No, she had no family in the area. After the meal, as people dispersed for walks or conversation in smaller groups, Fletcher asked if she'd like to see the rest of the ranch. "I'd enjoy that," Margaret said, ignoring Mrs. Miller's knowing smile from across the table. He showed her the barn with its neat stalls and hayloft, the corral where young horses were trained, and finally led her to a ridge overlooking the property. "Preston owns everything you can see to that far line of trees," Fletcher explained, pointing to the horizon. "Good water, good grass, everything needed for a successful operation." "And your cabin?" Margaret asked. "Mrs. Preston pointed it out earlier." "Nothing fancy, but it's mine or will be. Preston's letting me buy it and 5 acres over time, taking it from my wages." The simple statement revealed much about both men: Preston's fairness and Fletcher's determination to own something outright, however modest. "You said you hope to buy more land eventually." Fletcher nodded, gazing across the prairie. "A place like this, but smaller, enough for a decent herd, a garden." He hesitated, then added softly, "A family someday." The word hung between them, full of implication. Margaret found herself imagining such a life, challenging but rewarding, far from St. Louis society but rich in its own way. "It sounds wonderful," she said honestly. Fletcher turned to her, something unspoken in his expression. "Margaret, there you are, Mrs. Miller's voice interrupted whatever he had been about to say. "Mr. Fletcher, Pastor Wilson is asking for you, something about the wagon arrangements for return." With an apologetic glance at Margaret, Fletcher excused himself, leaving her alone on the ridge with Mrs. Miller, who seemed more interested in the view than had seemed likely moments before. "He's a good man," Mrs. Miller said after a moment, nodding toward Fletcher's retreating figure. "Not wealthy like some, but solid. Knows the value of hard work and keeping his word." "Yes, he seems to be," Margaret agreed cautiously. The older woman gave her a shrewd look. "Don't make the mistake of judging a man's worth by the size of his bankroll, Miss Whitfield. I made that error once, chose the man with the fattest cattle account over the one who made my heart sing. 30 years of comfort but precious little joy." Before Margaret could respond to this unexpected confidence, Mrs. Miller patted her arm and walked away, leaving her to ponder the advice and its relevance to her own situation. By late afternoon, the picnickers were preparing to depart. As Margaret helped gather leftover food, Fletcher approached with a concerned expression. "Jenkins was asking about you in town this morning," he said quietly. "Specifically, whether you receive regular correspondence from St. Louis." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "I'm not certain, but I think we should expect some development soon." He glanced toward the wagons being loaded. "I'd feel better if you stayed here tonight rather than returning to town. Mrs. Preston left the guest room prepared in case the weather turned. Stay here, alone. The impropriety would be scandalous in St. Louis. The ranch hands' wives would serve as chaperones," he assured her. "Mrs. Guthrie in particular is a formidable guardian of propriety, but you'd be safer here than in town if Harrington is planning something." Margaret hesitated, torn between concern for her reputation and fear of Harrington's unknown scheme. "Let me at least ride into town first thing tomorrow to check for any messages," Fletcher suggested. "If all seems well, you can return with me then." The compromise seemed reasonable. "Very well. I should let Mrs. Miller know I won't be returning today." Fletcher's relief was evident. "I'll arrange it with the Guthries. Their cabin is just beyond the main house." As the wagons departed, Margaret experienced a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation at finding herself unexpectedly spending the night at the ranch. Mrs. Guthrie, indeed a formidable woman with gray-streaked hair, and the bearing of a frontier queen, showed her to the guest room in the main house. "Mr. Fletcher explained you're staying as a precaution," she said, her tone making clear she expected no impropriety under her watch. "I've laid out a nightgown and some of Mrs. Preston's toiletries for your use." Thank you, Mrs. Guthrie. I appreciate your hospitality on such short notice. The older woman nodded. Supper's at 6 in the main kitchen. Mr. Fletcher mentioned you might like to rest before then. Left alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the neatly made bed, wondering if she'd overreacted to Fletcher's warning. Harrington was intimidating, certainly, but would he truly go to such lengths over a rejected job offer and wounded pride? Then, again, men of wealth and power often took rejection as a personal affront. Her father had disowned her over her refusal to marry according to his wishes. Was it so far-fetched that Harrington might pursue some vindictive course? Supper was a simple but hearty affair of beef stew and fresh bread, served in the ranch house kitchen. Fletcher joined them, having changed from his Sunday clothes to work attire, his hair damp from washing. "Everything's quiet," he reported. "I've asked the hands to keep an eye out for any unexpected visitors, but it's likely just a normal evening." Margaret nodded, aware of Mrs. Guthrie's watchful presence as she ladled stew into bowls. The conversation remained general throughout the meal: ranch matters, weather predictions, news from town, but Margaret caught Fletcher watching her with concern when he thought her attention was elsewhere. After supper, Mrs. Guthrie announced she would retire to her cabin but would return at dawn to prepare breakfast. Her pointed glance at Fletcher made clear her expectations regarding propriety. "I'll be in my cabin as well," Fletcher assured her. "Just wanted to check that Miss Whitfield has everything she needs first." When Mrs. Guthrie had departed, a slightly awkward silence fell. Margaret and Fletcher stood in the ranch house parlor, the lamplight casting long shadows. "Thank you for arranging this," Margaret said finally. "Though I still wonder if it's necessary." "Better cautious than caught unprepared," Fletcher replied. "Harrington's influence in Wichita is substantial. If he's decided you're a target for whatever reason, having some distance could be valuable." He moved to the window, peering out at the darkening prairie. "Margaret, there's something I should tell you, something I learned today that might explain Harrington's interest." The serious tone made her tense. "What is it?" "Jenkins was asking specifically about letters from Harrison Whitfield, whether any had arrived for you." Fletcher turned to face her. "He also mentioned that Whitfield is a major investor in a new railroad spur Harrington is trying to bring to Wichita." The connection clicked immediately in Margaret's mind. "So Harrington knows who my father is and sees me as potential leverage for his railroad investment." Fletcher nodded grimly. "If your father is concerned about your welfare or whereabouts, Harrington could position himself as either threat or savior, either way extracting favorable terms for his railroad project." "My father would never allow himself to be manipulated that way," Margaret said automatically, then reconsidered. "Though if it were presented as a matter of family honor rather than extortion." "Exactly." Fletcher moved closer. "You said there was no scandal when you left, but there wasn't," she insisted. "I simply left a note explaining I couldn't marry Crawford's son and was seeking my own path. There was gossip, certainly, but nothing truly scandalous by St. Louis standards." "But Harrington could manufacture scandal," Fletcher pointed out. "A respectable banker's daughter working in a frontier town, associating with cowboys." His expression darkened. "Or worse, he could imply impropriety that would truly damage your reputation." The realization made Margaret feel ill. Not for herself, she had already chosen to leave that world behind, but for how such rumors might affect her father's standing and business interests. "What should I do?" she asked quietly. Fletcher considered for a moment. "Perhaps write to your father directly. Explain your situation before Harrington can present his own version." The suggestion had merit, though the prospect of breaking 3 months of silence with her father was daunting. "I'll think about it," she promised. Fletcher nodded, then moved toward the door. "I should go. Mrs. Guthrie will have my hide if I linger too long." At the threshold, he paused. "Whatever you decide, Margaret, know that you have friends here who value you for yourself, not for your father's name or money." The simple sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you, Zachary. That means more than I can express. After he left, Margaret sat long in the parlor, considering her options. Finally, she moved to the small writing desk in the corner, found paper and pen, and began to write. Dear Father, it has been 3 months since I left St. Louis, and I hope this letter finds you well. Sleep came fitfully that night, Margaret's dreams filled with vague threats and her father's disapproving face. She woke at dawn to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, men calling to each other as they prepared for the day's work, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of activity from the kitchen where Mrs. Guthrie was presumably preparing breakfast. After dressing, Margaret sealed the letter she'd written the previous night, addressing it to Harrison Whitfield at his St. Louis residence. Whether she would actually send it remained undecided, but having composed her thoughts brought some measure of relief. Mrs. Guthrie greeted her with coffee and information that Fletcher had already ridden to town as promised. Said he'd be back by mid-morning with news. Meanwhile, there's eggs and bacon if you're hungry. The morning passed slowly. Margaret helped Mrs. Guthrie with household tasks, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar routine of domestic work. Around 10 o'clock, they heard approaching hoofbeats, and Margaret moved to the window to see Fletcher dismounting from his horse. His expression as he entered the house told her immediately that something was wrong. What is it? She asked, setting aside the shirt she'd been mending. Fletcher removed his hat, dust from the ride coating his clothes. 2 things. First, a telegram arrived for you this morning. He handed her a yellow envelope. Second, Edward Harrington and another gentleman were on the eastbound train that left at dawn. Eastbound, to St. Louis? Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the telegram. That would be my guess. Fletcher accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Guthrie silently offered, allowing Margaret privacy to read her message. The telegram was brief but clear. Arriving Wichita Thursday. Stop discussion required stop. Father. Margaret sank into a chair, the paper clutched in her hand. My father is coming to Wichita. He'll arrive Thursday. Fletcher set down his coffee. That's 4 days from now. Do you think Harrington contacted him? Almost certainly. She handed him the telegram. This discussion required it's exactly how he phrases matters he considers non-negotiable, Mrs. Guthrie, sensing private matters being discussed, murmured something about checking the laundry and discreetly left the kitchen. What will you do? Fletcher asked gently. Margaret straightened her shoulders. Face him. I've built the beginnings of a life here. I won't abandon it without at least trying to make him understand. Pride and something warmer flickered in Fletcher's eyes. That's courage, or foolishness, she replied with a faint smile. My father can be formidable when his mind is set. So can his daughter, it seems. Fletcher hesitated, then added, Would you like me to be present when you meet with him? The offer touched her deeply. That's kind, but I think I need to face him alone initially. This is between father and daughter first. He nodded, understanding. Of course. But remember what I said, you have friends here now. You don't have to stand alone. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for this man who offered support without attempting to take control of her problems. In St. Louis, the men she'd known would have either dismissed her concerns as feminine hysteria or insisted on managing the situation themselves. We should return to town, she said finally. I have preparations to make before Thursday. The ride back to Wichita gave Margaret time to organize her thoughts. By the time they reached the mercantile, she had formed a plan of sorts, continue her normal routine, prepare her small room to be presentable for her father's inspection, and gather her courage for the confrontation to come. Mrs. Preston was surprised but supportive when Margaret explained the situation. Family matters can be complicated, she said kindly. Know that you have a place here regardless of what your father says. The next few days passed in anxious anticipation. Margaret worked at the mercantile as usual but spent her evenings carefully preparing what she would say to her father. Fletcher came by daily, ostensibly for supplies but clearly checking on her welfare. Each visit strengthened her resolve. Here was tangible evidence of the connections she'd formed, the independence she'd established. Thursday dawned clear and warm. Margaret dressed in her finest remaining dress, the green silk from the social, now carefully altered to appear more suitable for daytime wear. Her hair she arranged simply but neatly, without the elaborate styling her St. Louis lady's maid had once created. The eastbound train was scheduled to arrive at 11. At 10:30, Margaret made her way to the station, her stomach knotted with anticipation. Fletcher had offered to accompany her, but she had gently declined, needing to face this moment on her own terms. The station platform was busy with the usual mix of travelers, merchants receiving shipments, and townspeople meeting arriving relatives. Margaret stood slightly apart, watching the eastern horizon for the plume of smoke that would announce the train's approach. Miss Whitfield. She turned to find Edward Harrington at her elbow, immaculately dressed and smiling with smug satisfaction. "Mr. Harrington, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought it appropriate to welcome Harrison Whitfield properly to Wichita," he replied smoothly. "He and I have developed a rather promising business relationship during my recent visit to St. Louis." Margaret kept her expression neutral despite the confirmation of her suspicions. "How enterprising of you to make such a journey on short notice." "Business waits for no man," Harrington said. "Particularly when opportunity presents itself so conveniently." Before she could respond to the implied threat, the train whistle sounded in the distance. Harrington smiled. "Ah, right on time. Shall we await your father together?" "I prefer to greet him privately," Margaret said firmly. Harrington's smile didn't waver. "As you wish. But we'll be meeting for dinner at my home this evening. Your father has already accepted my invitation. You're welcome to join us, of course." With a tip of his hat, he moved away, leaving Margaret seething at his presumption. The train pulled into the station moments later, billowing steam across the platform as it shuddered to a halt. Passengers began to disembark, traveling salesmen with sample cases, a few women in practical traveling clothes, a family with young children. And then, distinguished even among the first-class passengers by his immaculate attire and commanding presence, Harrison Whitfield. At 60, her father remained an imposing figure, tall and straight-backed, his hair more silver than the brown Margaret had inherited, his bearing that of a man accustomed to authority. His eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the platform until they found his daughter. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Margaret stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Father," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Margaret." His expression revealed little beyond careful assessment. "You appear well." "I am well," she confirmed. "Welcome to Wichita." "Hardly the welcome I anticipated when my only daughter disappeared 3 months ago," he replied, his tone dry but not overtly angry. "We have much to discuss." "Yes, we do." She glanced around the busy platform. "Perhaps somewhere more private. I've arranged for a private parlor at my hotel." He nodded curtly. "Lead the way." As they walked through town, Margaret was acutely aware of curious glances from passers-by. News traveled quickly in Wichita, and her father's distinguished appearance marked him immediately as someone of importance. The hotel had prepared a small private dining room as Margaret had requested. Once seated with tea served and the door closed against prying ears, the facade of civility her father had maintained cracked slightly. "You have any idea of the worry you've caused?" he demanded. "The embarrassment. Leaving without a proper word, rejecting a perfectly suitable match and then disappearing too." "This frontier outpost," Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I left a letter explaining my reasons." "A letter?" As if years of planning for your future could be dismissed with a few lines about following your heart. He set down his teacup with barely controlled force. "And to what end? I find my daughter working as a shop girl in a cattle town. Is this the grand independence you sought?" "It's honest work," Margaret replied, "and yes, it is independence. For the first time in my life, I'm making my own decisions, earning my own way." Harrison Whitfield's expression softened marginally. Margaret, I understand the romantic appeal of such notions. But reality is harsher than novels suggest. A woman alone in the world faces difficulties and dangers you've been sheltered from. I'm learning to navigate those difficulties, she said. And I've found that people can be kind and supportive, even without the influence of the Whitfield name and fortune. Her father frowned. Your Mr. Harrington seems to think otherwise. He suggests you've encountered significant challenges here. The deliberate manipulation infuriated Margaret. Mr. Harrington is not my anything, and whatever he's told you is colored by his own agenda. He offered me employment I declined, and he's been attempting to pressure me ever since. Harrison studied her face carefully. He mentioned you'd formed an attachment to a cowboy of limited means. Fletcher, I believe. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Fletcher is the manager of a successful cattle operation, not a simple cowboy. And any attachment between us is not Mr. Harrington's business, nor, with respect, is it yours. Everything concerning your welfare is my business, her father countered. You are my only child, Margaret, my heir. Did you truly believe I would simply allow you to throw away everything I've built? I'm not throwing anything away, she insisted. I'm building something different, something that's mine. Harrison sighed, suddenly looking his age. That penniless clerk Reynolds broke your heart, didn't he? This isn't about independence, it's about running from that pain. The assessment struck uncomfortably close to truth. Thomas was part of the reason I left, Margaret admitted. But once here, I discovered something important. I discovered that I'm capable of more than being someone's wife or daughter. I can stand on my own. Her father regarded her silently for a long moment. Harrington has offered me favorable terms on a railroad investment in exchange for bringing you home, he said finally. He seems quite determined to have you return to St. Louis. For his own purposes, not out of concern for me, Margaret replied. Father, please don't allow him to manipulate you. I've built my fortune by recognizing when I'm being manipulated, he said dryly. The question is why Harrington is so invested in your departure from Wichita. Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was necessary. I believe he initially saw me as a potential companion. When I refused, it became a matter of pride, especially when he learned of my friendship with Mr. Fletcher, with whom he has a long-standing rivalry. Harrison's expression darkened at the implication regarding Harrington's intentions. I see, and this Fletcher, what are his intentions? He is a friend, Margaret said carefully, a good man who has shown me kindness without expectations. Her father leaned back in his chair. Well, I intend to remain in Wichita several days. Perhaps I should meet this paragon of frontier virtue. The dry tone made Margaret both defensive and hopeful. If her father was willing to meet Fletcher, perhaps he was less determined to force her return than she'd feared. I'm sure that could be arranged, she said. But father, you should know I won't return to St. Louis, not to the life you planned for me. Harrison Whitfield studied his daughter's face, noting the quiet determination that reminded him painfully of her mother. We shall see, he said finally. For now, I'm simply glad to find you well. The admission, small as it was, felt like a significant concession. Margaret allowed herself a tentative smile. I am well, father, truly. They spoke for another hour careful conversation that avoided the more contentious subjects, while re-establishing a connection strained by months of silence. Harrison asked about her work at the Mercantile, listening with surprising interest to her descriptions of bringing order to the chaotic bookkeeping system. You always did have a head for numbers, he admitted grudgingly. Better than most of my junior clerks. When they finally emerged from the hotel, Margaret was cautiously optimistic. Her father had agreed to postpone any decisions until he'd spent more time in Wichita, and suggested they dine together the following evening rather than accepting Harrington's invitation. I find I'm rather tired from the journey, he told her. Please convey my regrets to Mr. Harrington. The small rebellion against Harrington's plans gave Margaret hope that her father might be more open to her perspective than she dared believe. After seeing her father settled at the hotel, Margaret returned to the Mercantile, where Mrs. Preston was waiting with poorly disguised curiosity. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "You don't look like you've been crying, which I take as a good sign." Margaret smiled at the older woman's candor. "Better than expected. He's angry and concerned, but he listened. That's more than I hoped for." "Well, that's something," Mrs. Preston said approvingly. "A father should listen to his daughter, especially one as sensible as you." The bell above the door jangled, and Margaret turned to see Fletcher entering, his expression a mixture of hope and concern. "I saw you walking with an older gentleman earlier," he said. "I assumed it was your father," Margaret nodded. "Yes, we've had our initial discussion." And the question contained layers of meaning. Was she leaving? Had her father forbidden their friendship? Was Harrington's scheme succeeding? "And we're having dinner tomorrow," she said, allowing a small smile. "He'd like to meet you, actually." Fletcher's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Me? Why?" "I may have mentioned your name," Margaret admitted. "In the context of explaining Harrington's behavior." Understanding dawned in Fletcher's eyes. "I see. And your father wants to assess this cowboy who's somehow involved in his daughter's situation." "Something like that," she agreed. "Though I'm not sure assess is the right word." "Interrogate, then," Fletcher suggested with a wry smile. "I'm familiar with the procedure. My sister brought home a few suitors in her day." The casual mention of his sister, the first time he'd referenced siblings, reminded Margaret how little she actually knew about Fletcher's past. "I didn't realize you had a sister." "Two, actually. Both married with children now, back in Georgia." A shadow crossed his features. "We correspond occasionally, but I haven't seen them since before the war." The admission revealed another layer of the losses Fletcher had endured, not just property and position, but family connections strained by distance and circumstance. "Well, my father isn't planning an interrogation," Margaret assured him, returning to the immediate concern. "Just dinner tomorrow at 7 at the hotel restaurant. Would you join us?" Fletcher nodded, his expression serious. "I'd be honored." He paused, then added quietly, "Whatever happens with your father, Margaret, I want you to know that these past weeks knowing you has meant more to me than I can properly express." The declaration, simple but heartfelt, touched Margaret deeply. "It's meant a great deal to me too, Zachary." Mrs. Preston, who had been pretending not to listen while rearranging a display of ribbons, cleared her throat. "Well, if you're dining with your father tomorrow, Miss Whitfield, you should take the afternoon to prepare. Those accounts can wait." Grateful for the older woman's tacit support, Margaret nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Preston. I think I will." Fletcher tipped his hat to both women. "Until tomorrow evening, then." As he left, Margaret found herself both anticipating and dreading the coming dinner. Her father was a shrewd judge of character, but he was also deeply invested in his vision of her future. Would he see the qualities in Zachary Fletcher that she had come to admire, or only the practical barriers to a match he would consider suitable? The following day passed in a haze of nervous preparation. Margaret took special care with her appearance, knowing her father would be assessing everything from her clothing to her posture for signs that frontier life had diminished his daughter. She arrived at the hotel restaurant slightly early to find her father already seated, examining the limited wine selection with barely concealed disdain. "The claret is tolerable," he said as she joined him. "Though I use the term generously." Margaret smiled despite her nerves. "Wichita has many virtues, father, but fine wines aren't among them." "Evidently," he set aside the list. "Your Mr. Fletcher will be joining us shortly." "He's not my Mr. Fletcher," she corrected automatically, "and yes, he should arrive soon." As if summoned by their conversation, Zachary Fletcher appeared in the restaurant doorway. Margaret's breath caught slightly at the transformation. Gone was the practical working attire she was accustomed to seeing. Instead, Fletcher wore a well-tailored black suit that, while not the height of Eastern fashion, spoke of quality and care. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with quiet confidence as he approached their table. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, extending his hand. Zachary Fletcher. Thank you for including me in your dinner plans. Harrison Whitfield rose, assessing the younger man with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating potential business partners. Mr. Fletcher, my daughter speaks highly of you. They settled at the table, the initial exchange of pleasantries giving way to more substantive conversation as the meal progressed. Margaret watched with growing hope as her father engaged Fletcher on topics from cattle markets to banking regulations, clearly testing the depth of his knowledge and character. For his part, Fletcher answered with thoughtful honesty, neither exaggerating his accomplishments nor downplaying his ambitions. When Harrison inquired about his background, he spoke without embarrassment of his family's lost prosperity and his years of rebuilding. So you understand what it means to have wealth and position and to lose it, Harrison observed, cutting his steak with precise movements. Yes, sir, Fletcher agreed. It teaches a man what truly matters and what's merely trappings, and what matters in your estimation. Fletcher considered for a moment. Character, integrity, the willingness to work for what you believe in. His gaze briefly met Margaret's. Connections with people who value you for yourself, not your circumstances. Harrison nodded slowly. Admirable sentiments. Though practical considerations can't be dismissed entirely. No, sir, Fletcher agreed. A man should be able to support himself and those who depend on him. But I've seen men with fortunes who live in poverty of spirit, and men of modest means who live richly because they have what money can't buy. The observation hung in the air, its relevance to Margaret's situation unmistakable. Harrison Whitfield's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested the point had registered. You manage the Preston cattle operation, he said, changing tack. With what success? We've increased the herd by 20% over 3 years, Fletcher replied, and improved the bloodlines through selective breeding. Last year's profit was the highest in the ranch's history. Harrison nodded approvingly despite himself. And your own ambitions? Do you intend to remain a manager indefinitely? No, sir. I'm purchasing land from Preston starting small, but with plans to expand as my means allow. The remainder of the meal continued in similar fashion, Harrison probing, Fletcher responding with quiet confidence. By the time dessert was served, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic. Her father hadn't openly approved, but neither had he dismissed Fletcher outright. As coffee was poured, Harrison turned to his daughter. Margaret, would you excuse us for a few moments? I'd like to speak privately with Mr. Fletcher. Though alarmed at the prospect of what might be said without her presence, Margaret nodded. Of course, father, I'll wait in the lobby. As she left the table, she caught Fletcher's reassuring glance. Whatever her father intended to discuss, Fletcher would face it with the same steady composure he'd shown throughout the evening. The hotel lobby was mercifully empty of acquaintances who might question why Margaret Whitfield was pacing anxiously, while her father and Zachary Fletcher remained deep in conversation in the restaurant. 20 minutes passed before the men emerged, both wearing expressions that revealed nothing of their discussion. It's getting late, her father said. I'll see you tomorrow, Margaret. Perhaps you might show me this mercantile where you've been employed. Of course, she agreed, searching his face for clues. Good night, father. As Harrison retired to his room, Fletcher offered to walk Margaret back to the mercantile. Once outside in the cool evening air, she could no longer contain her curiosity. What did he say to you? Fletcher's expression was thoughtful. He asked about my intentions toward you. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. That's rather presumptuous of him. Is it? Fletcher stopped walking, turning to face her in the glow of a street lamp. Margaret, I think we both know that what's developing between us is more than friendship. The directness took her breath away. Zachary, let me finish, he said gently. Your father asked if I could offer you the life you deserve. It's a fair question, one I've asked myself repeatedly since I realized how deeply I've come to care for you. Margaret's heart raced. And what did you tell him? The truth. That I can't offer mansions or servants or the society life you were raised for. Fletcher took her hands in his. But I can offer honesty, hard work, and a love that values you for exactly who you are, not for your father's name or fortune. You told my father you love me, Margaret asked, astonished at such boldness. Fletcher smiled. I did, though I should probably tell you directly as well. His expression grew serious. I love you, Margaret Whitfield. Not the banker's daughter from St. Louis, but the woman who faced adversity with courage, who built a new life through her own efforts, who sees value in things beyond material wealth. The declaration, so honest, so unlike Thomas's poetic but ultimately hollow professions, filled Margaret with a joy she hadn't expected to feel again. And what did my father say to that? She managed to ask. He said I was either very brave or very foolish to declare myself so plainly. Fletcher's smile returned, and then he asked what I would do if he forbade any attachment between us. Margaret tensed. And you said? That I would respect his concerns as her father, but ultimately the choice belonged to you, and that any woman who had the courage to leave comfort and security to forge her own path deserved the dignity of making her own decisions. The answer was so perfectly right, acknowledging her father's legitimate concern while affirming her autonomy, that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. He didn't give his blessing, Fletcher continued, but neither did he forbid anything. I believe he's reserving judgment until he better understands the situation here, including Harrington's role in all this. Margaret nodded, knowing her father's methodical approach to decisions. That's actually more than I expected. He rarely reconsiders once his mind is set. He loves you, Fletcher said simply. That much is clear, whatever his other feelings about your choices. They had reached the mercantile's side entrance. In the shadow of the building, Margaret felt a sudden clarity about her own feelings she'd been cautious about acknowledging even to herself after Thomas's betrayal. Zachary, she said softly, I need to tell you something as well. He waited, his expression open. When Thomas abandoned our plans, I promised myself I wouldn't be so foolish again, trusting in love over practical considerations. She took a deep breath. But I've realized that the real foolishness was in confusing infatuation for love. What I feel for you is different, deeper, truer. You've seen me at my most vulnerable and respected my strength anyway. Fletcher's hands tightened around hers. Are you saying, I love you too, Margaret said, the words both frightening and liberating. Not for what you can give me, but for who you are, a man of integrity and kindness, who believes poverty with love beats riches without. The phrase seemed to strike Fletcher particularly. My father used to say that, he said softly. When we lost everything after the war and people pitied us, he would say, we may have lost our fortune, but we still have each other. Poverty with love beats riches without, every time. The coincidence seemed almost fated, as if confirming the rightness of what was growing between them. Your father was a wise man, Margaret said. Yes, Fletcher agreed. And I think, given time, yours might prove reasonable as well. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Margaret closed the distance between them, allowing their lips to meet in a kiss that spoke of both tenderness and promise. When they parted, Fletcher touched her cheek gently. Whatever comes with your father, with Harrington, we'll face it together if that's what you want. It is, she said with certainty, though I suspect neither challenge will be simple. Few worthwhile things are, he replied with a smile. Get some rest. Tomorrow may prove interesting for all of us. Margaret entered the mercantile with her heart lighter than it had been in months, despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead. Whatever her father decided, whatever schemes Harrington might attempt, she had found something in Wichita she hadn't dared hope for, not just independence, but a love based on mutual respect and genuine understanding. Morning brought news that shook Wichita's usual routine. Edward Harrington had been arrested for financial improprieties related to the railroad project specifically, misrepresenting investments and attempting to coerce land sales through fraudulent means. The arresting officer was none other than a federal marshal who had arrived on the same train as Harrison Whitfield. By mid-morning, Margaret's father appeared at the Mercantile, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "I assume you've heard about Harrington," he said without preamble. Margaret nodded. "The whole town's talking about it, but I don't understand how did this happen so suddenly?" Harrison Whitfield allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Not suddenly at all. The Treasury Department has been investigating Harrington's railroad schemes for months. When he approached me in St. Louis with his proposition regarding you, I contacted some associates in the federal government. The timing of my visit to Wichita was coordinated." The revelation stunned Margaret. "You came here as part of a trap for Harrington." "I came here for my daughter," he corrected. The fact that it aligned with the Treasury Department's interests was convenient for all concerned. Margaret studied her father with new eyes. "So you never intended to force me back to St. Louis?" Harrison sighed, suddenly looking tired. "Margaret, when you left, I was angry, hurt, convinced you'd return within weeks when you discovered the realities of the world beyond our protected circle." He shook his head slowly. "But you didn't return, and your absence, it made me question many things." "What things?" she asked cautiously. "Whether I'd been too rigid, whether your mother would have approved of my handling of the situation." He met her gaze directly. "Whether I was willing to lose my only child over pride and plans that perhaps served my vision more than your happiness." The admission so unlike her father's usual certainty moved Margaret deeply. "I never wanted to hurt you, Father. I just needed to find my own way." "I'm beginning to understand that," he said, "though I still believe you could have found a less dramatic method of asserting your independence." A hint of their old rapport flickered between them. "Perhaps," Margaret conceded with a small smile. "But then I wouldn't have found Wichita or the Prestons or Fletcher," her father finished. "Yes, well, that remains a more complicated matter." Margaret straightened. "My feelings for Zachary aren't complicated at all." Harrison held up a hand. "Before you defend him further, you should know I've spent the morning making inquiries about Mr. Fletcher's reputation and business acumen." "And?" she asked, tension returning. "And I find myself reluctantly impressed," her father admitted. "His employers speak highly of his character and abilities, his plans for expansion are modest but sound, and he appears to genuinely care for your welfare rather than your prospects." Relief washed through Margaret. "He does." "And I care deeply for him." Harrison nodded slowly. "So I gathered from your conversation last night, which brings me to a proposal, not an ultimatum," he added quickly, seeing her expression harden. "Simply an option for you to consider." "What kind of proposal?" "I have business interests that could benefit from expansion into this region," he said carefully. "With Harrington's operation now in disarray, there's an opportunity for a legitimate banking presence in Wichita." Margaret frowned slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "That I might establish a branch here with proper management." He paused significantly. "Management that might include my daughter, whose skill with numbers and accounts has apparently been wasted on social engagements and needlework." The offer took Margaret completely by surprise. "You would?" "Allow me to work in your bank. As an actual employee, not just a figurehead, under appropriate supervision initially," he qualified. "But yes, with real responsibility. You've demonstrated both capability and determination these past months. Those qualities shouldn't be wasted, regardless of your gender." The concession represented such a significant shift in her father's thinking that Margaret momentarily struggled to respond. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Harrison replied. "It would provide you with meaningful work, financial security, and the independence you've sought while allowing you to remain in Wichita if that's truly your wish." The unspoken implication regarding Fletcher hung between them. Her father wasn't directly approving any attachment, but neither was he placing obstacles in its path. "And what of Zachary?" she asked directly. "Would this arrangement come with conditions regarding my personal life?" Harrison sighed. "Margaret, you're 20 years old." While I might wish for a different match for you, one with more established prospects, I've learned these past months that my wishes cannot dictate your heart." He straightened his shoulders. "I ask only that you proceed with appropriate caution and propriety." It was more acceptance than Margaret had dared hope for. "Thank you, Father. I will consider your proposal carefully." Harrison nodded, satisfied for the moment. "Good. Now, perhaps you might show me exactly what improvements you've made to this mercantile's bookkeeping system. I find myself curious about your methods." The remainder of her father's visit passed in unexpected harmony. Harrison Whitfield spent hours with his daughter, observing her work at the mercantile, discussing the possibility of a banking branch in Wichita, and even accompanying her to Sunday services, where he met many of the townspeople who had welcomed Margaret into their community. To her surprise, he also arranged a meeting with Fletcher at the Preston Ranch, touring the operation and discussing cattle markets with genuine interest. Whatever his reservations about Fletcher as a suitor for his daughter, Harrison Whitfield respected competence and integrity when he encountered it. On his final evening in Wichita, Harrison invited both Margaret and Fletcher to dinner at the hotel. The conversation flowed more easily than at their first meal together, touching on everything from literature to frontier development. "I've made an offer on the Harrington Bank building," Harrison announced as dessert was served. "Assuming the legal matters are resolved satisfactorily, Whitfield Banking will establish a presence in Wichita by year's end." "Congratulations," Fletcher said sincerely. "Wichita needs honest banking services, especially with the cattle trade expanding," Harrison nodded. "Indeed. And I'll need trustworthy management." He turned to his daughter. "Margaret has agreed to take a position with appropriate training." Fletcher's eyes widened slightly as he looked at Margaret. "You'll be staying in Wichita then?" "Yes," she confirmed, unable to suppress her smile at his evident delight. "Father has convinced me that my skills might be better applied to banking than merchandising, though I'm grateful to the Prestons for giving me my first opportunity." "They'll be sorry to lose you," Fletcher said, "but I can't pretend I'm not pleased at the news." Harrison Whitfield observed the exchange with a mixture of resignation and reluctant approval. "Mr. Fletcher has also agreed to assist with evaluating cattle operation loans for the bank on a consulting basis. His expertise will be valuable in assessing such ventures." The arrangement represented a compromise Margaret hadn't expected, her father accepting her chosen location and her feelings for Fletcher, while ensuring she had meaningful work and Fletcher had additional income to support his ambitions. "It seems you've thought of everything, Father," Margaret said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "Hardly everything," he replied dryly, "but enough to ensure my daughter's welfare while respecting her independence, a balance I'm still learning to navigate." As the evening concluded and Harrison prepared to return to St. Louis the following morning, he took a moment to speak privately with Margaret. "I still believe you could have had an easier path," he said, his tone softer than she was accustomed to hearing. "But perhaps your mother was right when she encouraged you to follow your heart. She saw strength in you that I sometimes overlooked." The reference to her mother touched Margaret deeply. "I think about her often, what she would think of my choices." "She would be proud of your courage," Harrison said. "As am I, though it's taken me time to recognize it as courage rather than mere willfulness." The admission was perhaps the most meaningful gift her father could have given her. "Thank you, Father, for coming here, for listening, for trying to understand. We Whitfields are nothing if not adaptable," he said with a faint smile. "Your new circumstances are not what I envisioned, but I can see they bring you satisfaction." "They do," she confirmed, "though I've missed you." Harrison nodded, momentarily unable to speak. Then, with a clearing of his throat, he resumed his more typical brisk manner. "Well, I expect regular reports on the bank's operations once we're established, and perhaps you might consider visiting St. Louis occasionally. The house feels rather empty without you." It was as close to sentimentality as Harrison Whitfield was likely to come, and Margaret recognized the olive branch for what it was. "I'd like that," she said. "Perhaps for Christmas?" "That would be suitable," he agreed. With a final, awkward pat of her shoulder, he bid her good night, leaving Margaret to reflect on how dramatically her circumstances had changed in just a few days. The following morning, Margaret and Fletcher stood together on the station platform as the westbound train prepared for departure. "Safe journey, Mr. Whitfield," Fletcher said, shaking her father's hand, "and thank you for your trust in my consulting abilities." Harrison gave him a measuring look. "Prove that trust well placed, Mr. Fletcher, in all matters." The implied warning wasn't lost on either of them, but Fletcher merely nodded respectfully. "I intend to, sir." Harrison turned to his daughter. "The bank paperwork will be completed within a month. In the meantime, continue your work at the mercantile. The experience will serve you well." "Yes, father," Margaret agreed. "And thank you for everything." With a final handshake and a somewhat stiff embrace for his daughter, Harrison Whitfield boarded the train, leaving Margaret and Fletcher standing together as the engine built steam. "Are you all right?" Fletcher asked as the train pulled away. Margaret nodded, watching the receding figure of her father in the observation car. "Better than all right. For the first time since I left St. Louis, I feel like I'm not running away from something. I'm moving toward something better." Fletcher took her hand, a gesture that would have been scandalous in St. Louis society but felt perfectly natural here on the Wichita platform. "Your father is an impressive man, formidable but fair in his own way." "He is," Margaret agreed. "Though I never expected him to bend so far from his original position." "Love can change even the most rigid perspectives," Fletcher observed, speaking of which. He hesitated, then continued more formally. "Margaret, I know this is perhaps premature, but your father's visit has clarified some things for me." Her heart quickened. "What things?" "That life can change direction unexpectedly, that opportunities should be embraced when they appear." He turned to face her fully. "That when you find someone who sees your true self and loves you for it, you shouldn't waste time with unnecessary caution." The implication of his words made Margaret's breath catch. "Zachary, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you. That my life has been transformed since you arrived in Wichita. And that while I can't offer you the luxury you were raised with, I can promise to work every day to build a life worthy of you." His expression was earnest, vulnerable. "Not today or tomorrow, but when you're ready, when we've both proven to your father that this isn't a hasty decision, I want to ask you to be my wife." The declaration, not quite a proposal, but a clear statement of intent, filled Margaret with joy. "When that day comes," she said softly, "my answer will be yes." Relief and happiness brightened his features. "Even knowing it would be a simpler life than you were raised for," Margaret smiled, remembering the phrase that had come to mean so much to both of them. "Poverty with love beats riches without, every time." He leaned forward to kiss her, no longer concerned with the propriety that had restrained him during her father's visit. Margaret returned the kiss with equal fervor, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. When they finally parted, Fletcher offered his arm. "Shall I walk you back to the mercantile? I believe you still have a job there for the next month." Margaret laughed, taking his arm with a sense of rightness that transcended the circumstances that had brought her to Wichita. "Lead the way, Mr. Fletcher." As they walked through the streets of what had become her home, Margaret reflected on the journey that had led her here from the protected wealth of St. Louis to the independent life she was building in Wichita. She had left seeking freedom from her father's control, only to discover that true independence came not from rejection of family ties, but from the strength to forge her own path while maintaining those connections. And most unexpectedly, she had found love, not the fragile infatuation she had felt for Thomas, but a deeper bond built on mutual respect and shared values. Zachary Fletcher had shown her that wealth was measured not only in dollars, but in character, integrity, and the courage to stand by one's convictions. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Margaret Whitfield became Margaret Fletcher in a simple ceremony attended by the Prestons, her father, who had traveled from St. Louis for the occasion, and most of Wichita's residents. The bride wore a gown of ivory silk, a gift from her father, while the groom stood tall in a new suit, his pride evident as he watched his bride approach. The reception was held at the Preston Ranch, where tables had been set beneath the same cottonwoods that had shaded their first picnic. Harrison Whitfield, still somewhat reserved but notably warmer than in previous months, raised a toast to the couple. "To my daughter and her husband," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered guests. "May your partnership prove as successful in life as it has already proven in business." The reference acknowledged the reality that had developed since his first visit. Margaret had indeed taken a position at the newly established Whitfield Bank, where her natural aptitude for finance had flourished. Meanwhile, Fletcher had expanded his consulting role while continuing to manage the Preston Ranch and develop his own small property. Together, they had established themselves as a respected couple in Wichita society, she bringing Eastern refinement tempered by frontier practicality. He contributing honest industry and integrity that earned admiration from even the most skeptical. As the celebration continued into evening, with lanterns illuminating the dancing area much as they had at the social where Margaret and Fletcher had first danced together, the couple found a moment alone near the creek. "Happy, Mrs. Fletcher?" Zachary asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she confirmed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't quite believe how everything has unfolded. A year ago, I was a sheltered society girl in St. Louis, convinced my life was ruined because a clerk wouldn't elope with me," Fletcher chuckled. "And I was a cowboy with ambitions but limited prospects, certainly never expecting that Harrison Whitfield's daughter would look twice at me." "Life takes unexpected turns," Margaret mused. "When my father cast me out for loving a poor man, I thought it was the end of my world. Instead, it was just the beginning." "And now," Fletcher asked, turning her to face him, "any regrets about choosing this life instead of returning to St. Louis society?" Margaret shook her head, absolute certainty in her expression. "None whatsoever. You were right from the beginning, poverty with love beats riches without. Though," she added with a smile, "I'm pleased we've managed to find both love and modest prosperity." Fletcher laughed, drawing her closer. "Your father's influence, no doubt. He's proven surprisingly supportive once he accepted the inevitable." "He respects you," Margaret said. "Your work ethic, your integrity, those matter more to him than social position, though he'd never have admitted it a year ago." The music from the reception drifted toward them, a waltz much like the one they had first danced to. Fletcher extended his hand with a formal bow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Fletcher?" Margaret curtsied gracefully before stepping into his arms. "Always, Mr. Fletcher." As they moved together beneath the starlit Kansas sky, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. She had left St. Louis seeking independence, but had found something far more valuable, a love based on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to choose one's own path. Her father, watching from a distance as his daughter danced with her new husband, felt a mixture of emotions he would never fully express: pride in her strength, admiration for her conviction, and a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps she had been right all along. Margaret had found her own way, and in doing so, had taught her father that true worth wasn't measured by social position or financial assets, but by the courage to follow one's heart even when the path seemed uncertain. In the years that followed, the Fletcher family thrived. The small property Zachary had initially purchased grew as his cattle operation expanded, while Margaret's role at the bank evolved into full management when her father decided to remain primarily in St. Louis. Their home, built with care on land overlooking the creek, became known for its warm hospitality rather than ostentatious luxury. When their first child arrived, a son they named Harrison Zachary Fletcher, the elder Harrison traveled from St. Louis with gifts far more practical than the silver spoons he might once have considered essential. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, named Elizabeth after Margaret's mother. Life in Wichita presented challenges: harsh winters, economic fluctuations affecting the cattle market, the everyday difficulties of building a community on the frontier. But through it all, Margaret and Zachary faced each obstacle together, their partnership strengthened by the knowledge that they had chosen each other despite convention and circumstance. On their 5th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard, Fletcher presented Margaret with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a simple gold locket. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper with familiar handwriting: "Poverty with love beats riches without." "My father's words," Fletcher explained. "I found them in a letter he wrote to my mother during the war when everything was uncertain. I've carried them with me since he died as a reminder of what truly matters." Margaret closed her fingers around the locket, deeply moved by the gift and its significance. "It's perfect," she said. "A reminder of how we began and what we've built together." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, casting long shadows across the land they had come to love, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from her desperate flight from St. Louis to the rich life they now shared. She had been cast out for loving a poor man, only to discover that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts or social standing. In Zachary's arms, in the home they had built together, in the family they were raising with values of integrity and independence, Margaret had found the answer to a question she hadn't even known to ask: what makes a life truly rich? The answer, she now knew with absolute certainty, wasn't to be found in her father's mansion in St. Louis or in the society that had once seemed so essential to her existence. It was here, in the love she had chosen and the life she had built with her own hands and heart. Poverty with love truly did beat riches without every time.